The unmarked sedan pulled into Chief Marcus Rivera's driveway at 6:47 a.m., its occupants wearing tactical gear and badges that gleamed too bright in the morning sun. They didn't know that the man watering his roses had spent 15 years climbing the ranks of the state police, or that is German Shepherd. Atlas was trained to detect more than just drugs. As the fake officers approached with their rehearsed authority, Marcus felt his service weapon against his hip and smiled. The Willowbrook HOA had finally crossed a line they couldn't uncross. Today, they would learn the difference between the sprinkler system activated at exactly 6:30 a.m. sending arcs of water across the pristine lawn of 247 Maple Ridge Drive. Chief Marcus Rivera adjusted the nozzle on his garden hose, directing a gentle stream toward the prize-winning roses that lined his front walkway. The morning air carried the scent of jasmine and fresh mulch, punctuated by the distant hum of suburban life awakening. At 42, Marcus had learned to appreciate these quiet moments before the chaos of his day began. As chief of the State Police Criminal Investigation Division, he commanded respect from hardened criminals and seasoned officers alike. But here, in the manicured paradise of Willowbrook Estates, he was just another homeowner trying to maintain his property values. Or so he thought. Atlas, his 5-year-old German Shepherd, lifted his head from his morning patrol of the backyard, ears pricked forward. The dog's training kicked in instantly. Something was wrong. Marcus followed his partner's gaze to the unmarked sedan that had just turned the corner, moving too slowly, too deliberately. "Easy, boy," Marcus murmured, his hand instinctively moving to his hip where his Glock 19 rested in its concealed holster. 15 years of law enforcement had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, every instinct screamed danger. The sedan, a black Crown Victoria that screamed police vehicle to anyone who'd spent 5 minutes around law enforcement, pulled into his driveway with the confidence of authority. 2 men emerged, both wearing tactical vests over polo shirts, gold badges hanging from retractable chains, and expressions that suggested they'd rather be anywhere else. The driver was tall and lean, maybe 45, with the kind of mustache that suggested he'd watched too many cop shows. His partner was shorter, stockier, with nervous eyes that darted between Marcus and the house like he was casing the joint. "Morning, sir," the tall one called out, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone used to being obeyed. "I'm Detective Johnson, this is Detective Martinez. We need to speak with you about some violations that have been reported." Marcus continued watering his roses, studying the men with the calm intensity that had made him legendary in interrogation rooms. The badges were wrong, too shiny, too new. The tactical vests were department store quality, not the Kevlar he'd worn for over a decade. And the way they carried themselves. Amateur hour. Violations? Marcus asked, turning off the hose and coiling it with deliberate slowness. "What kind of violations?" "Property violations," Martinez spoke up, his voice betraying the slightest tremor. "We've received multiple complaints about unauthorized structures and landscaping modifications." Atlas moved closer to Marcus, his body language shifting into the alert stance that meant he was ready for action. The dog had been trained to read human behavior, and something about these men was setting off every alarm in his canine brain. "I see," Marcus said, his voice deceptively calm. "And which department are you with, gentlemen?" "Metro County Sheriff's Office," Johnson replied without hesitation. "Property Crimes Division." Marcus almost smiled. Metro County didn't have a Property Crimes Division. He would know, he'd worked closely with their sheriff for 8 years. But he decided to play along, curious to see how far this charade would go. "Well, gentlemen, I'm certainly willing to cooperate. What seems to be the problem?" Johnson pulled out a clipboard with papers that looked official from a distance. "We've received complaints about your rose garden extending beyond the approved property lines, installation of unauthorized outdoor lighting, and..." He consulted his notes, a keeping of an aggressive animal without proper permits. At the mention of Atlas, Marcus felt his jaw tighten. The dog was a decorated canine officer who'd helped take down drug dealers, tracked missing children, and saved countless lives. The fact that these wannabe cops were calling him aggressive was a line too far. "Is that so?" Marcus asked, his voice dropping to the tone that made suspects start sweating in interview rooms. "And who exactly filed these complaints?" "I'm Not at liberty to, let me guess, Marcus interrupted, taking a step closer. The Willowbrook HOA. The look that passed between the two men was all the confirmation he needed. Johnson cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. Sir, we are going to need you to remove the unauthorized plantings immediately and report to the county office within 48 hours to discuss the animal situation. And if you refuse, then we'll have to escalate this to the appropriate authorities, Martinez said, his hand moving to what Marcus now realized was probably a fake badge rather than a weapon. Marcus looked at his roses, the ones he'd planted after his wife Sarah's death 3 years ago, the ones that helped him process his grief, the ones that had won the Neighborhood Beautification Award just last month. He thought about Atlas, who'd been his partner through the darkest period of his life. And he thought about the Willowbrook HOA, led by the petty tyrant Margaret Thornfield, who'd been making his life miserable for 2 years. You know what, gentlemen? Marcus said, his smile never wavering. I think there's been a misunderstanding. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out his leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal his state police badge, real gold, properly aged, with the weight of actual authority behind it. I'm Chief Marcus Rivera, State Police Criminal Investigation Division. This is my partner, Atlas, a decorated K-9 officer. And you two are about to have a very bad day. The color drained from Johnson's face like water from a broken dam. Martinez took an unconscious step backward, his hand moving away from his fake badge as if it had suddenly caught fire. There must be some mistake. Oh, there's definitely a mistake, Marcus said, his voice now carrying the full authority of his position. The mistake was thinking you could impersonate police officers on my property, threaten my dog, and intimidate me into compliance with your little HOA power trip. Atlas sensed the shift in his handler's demeanor and moved into a protective stance, his training taking over. The dog's presence seemed to fill the space between them, a reminder that Marcus wasn't just any homeowner they could push around. Sir, you can explain it to a judge, Marcus cut him off. But first, you're going to explain it to me. Who hired you? How much did they pay you? And exactly what did they think this little performance was going to accomplish? Johnson's mustache twitched as he weighed his options. Run and face charges for impersonating an officer, or cooperate and hope for leniency. The choice wasn't difficult. Look, Chief, we are just trying to make a living. Some lady from the HOA said you were causing problems, refusing to follow the rules. She said you needed to be handled properly and that regular channels weren't working. Margaret Thornfield. Yeah, that's her. She paid us $500 each to come out here, show some authority, get you to back down. She said you were just another suburban tough guy who'd fold the minute he saw badges. Marcus felt a cold fury building in his chest. For 2 years, Margaret had been escalating her harassment. Late-night visits to complain about Atlas's barking. Threats to fine him for infractions that existed only in her imagination. Anonymous complaints to his superiors about his inability to follow simple community rules. But this was criminal. Turn around, Marcus commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd arrested killers and drug lords. Hands behind your back. Chief, please, you impersonated police officers. You attempted to intimidate a law enforcement official. You threatened a K-9 officer. And you did it all for money. Marcus pulled out his phone, speed dialing his lieutenant. Tommy. It's Marcus. I need 2 units at my house. Now. And bring cuffs, I've got a couple of wannabe cops who need to take a ride downtown. As the sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, Marcus looked at his roses, still perfect in the morning light. The Willowbrook HOA had just declared war on the wrong man. And they had no idea what was coming next. The Real police arrived within minutes, their genuine badges and authentic authority a stark contrast to the theater that had just unfolded. As Johnson and Martinez were led away in handcuffs, Marcus caught sight of a familiar figure watching from behind the curtains of the house across the street. Margaret Thornfield. Her pale face was pressed against the glass, her eyes wide with the dawning realization that her carefully orchestrated intimidation had not only failed but had landed her in far more trouble than she'd ever imagined. Marcus waved at her, his smile sharp as a blade. The game had changed. The rules had changed. And Margaret Thornfield was about to learn that when you come for the king, you better not miss. The war for Willowbrook Estates had begun. And the HOA had just armed their enemy with everything he needed to destroy them. The Willowbrook Community Centre had never hosted a meeting quite like this one. Margaret Thornfield sat at the head of the polished oak table, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against the surface as she waited for the other board members to arrive. The emergency session had been called for 7 p.m. sharp, just 12 hours after her carefully orchestrated plan had exploded in her face. At 63, Margaret had ruled the Willowbrook HOA with an iron fist for 8 years. She'd survived challenges from previous residents who dared to question her authority, crushed opposition through legal threats and financial pressure, and built a reputation as someone who got results. But she'd never faced an enemy like Marcus Rivera. The community center's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the motivational posters that lined the walls. Unity through compliance, read one. A beautiful community starts with following rules, proclaimed another. Margaret had commissioned them herself, believing that constant reminders of order would keep the residents in line. The door opened with a soft chime, and Harold Peterson shuffled in, his 70-year-old frame bent with arthritis and resignation. As the HOA treasurer, Harold had spent the last 5 years watching Margaret's increasingly aggressive tactics drain their legal fund and create enemies throughout the neighborhood. Margaret, he said, settling into his usual chair with a grimace. I heard about this morning. Please tell me you didn't actually. I did what needed to be done, Margaret snapped, her voice carrying the edge that had intimidated residents. For nearly a decade, Rivera has been flouting our rules for months. Someone had to take action. By hiring fake police officers. Harold's voice cracked with disbelief. Margaret, those men are in jail. Real jail. And Rivera isn't just some random homeowner, he's the chief of the State Police Criminal Investigation Division. I know exactly who he is, Margaret said, though the color had drained from her cheeks. And I know that his position doesn't give him the right to ignore our community standards. The door opened again, admitting Janet Wu, the HOA secretary, and Robert Martinez, the newest board member who'd been elected just 3 months ago on a platform of common sense governance. Both looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. This is insane, Janet said without preamble, her usually calm demeanor cracking. I've been fielding calls all day. Half the neighborhood is talking about police cars in Rivera's driveway. The other half is asking if the HOA board has lost its collective mind. Robert slammed his laptop bag onto the table with more force than necessary. I ran for this position to help make reasonable improvements to our community. Not to be an accessory to criminal impersonation of police officers. Alleged criminal impersonation, Margaret corrected, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. Oh, it's not alleged, came a new voice from the doorway. It's very, very real. Everyone turned to see Marcus Rivera stepping into the community center, Atlas at his side. The German Shepherd's presence seemed to fill the room, his intelligent eyes scanning each board member with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. Marcus had changed from his gardening clothes into a crisp white shirt and dark slacks, his state police badge visible on his belt. He moved with the confident stride of someone who'd walked into hostile territory before and emerged victorious. Chief Rivera, Harold said, half rising from his chair. We didn't expect you to what? Show up uninvited to a meeting about my own neighborhood. Marcus pulled out a chair and sat down uninvited, Atlas settling beside him with military precision. I thought I'd save everyone some time and address your concerns directly. Margaret's face flushed red. This is a private HOA board meeting. You have no right to. Actually, I have every right, Marcus interrupted, his voice carrying the authority that had made hardened criminals confess to crimes they'd sworn they'd never committed. According to the Willowbrook HOA charter, which I've spent the afternoon studying very carefully, any homeowner can address the board regarding matters that directly affect them. He pulled out a thick folder and placed it on the table. And since you hired 2 men to impersonate police officers, trespass on my property, and threaten both me and my canine partner, I'd say this matter affects me quite directly. Janet Wu looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair. Chief Rivera, I want you to know that not all of us were aware of Mrs. Thornfield's methods. Is that so? Marcus opened his folder and pulled out a series of documents. Because according to the financial records I obtained through a public information request this afternoon, the HOA has been paying legal fees to the law firm of Brennan, Walsh and Associates for the past 6 months. Bills totaling over $20,000. Harold's face went pale. Legal fees? For what? Marcus smiled, though there was no warmth in it. According to the itemized invoices, research into enforcement options for non-compliant homeowners and alternative dispute resolution methods. Tell me, Mrs. Thornfield, what kind of alternative dispute resolution involves hiring fake cops? Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for her water glass. You can't prove anything. Can't I? Marcus pulled out his phone and placed it on the table. This is a recording of my conversation with Johnson and Martinez after their arrest. They were quite talkative once they realized they were facing felony charges. He pressed play and the room filled with the sound of Johnson's voice. Look, Chief, we are just trying to make a living. Some lady from the HOA said you were causing problems, refusing to follow the rules. She said you needed to be handled properly and that regular channels weren't working. Margaret's voice came through. Clearly, Margaret Thornfield. Yeah, that's her. She paid us $500 each to come out here, show some authority, get you to back down. She said you were just another suburban tough guy who'd fold the minute he saw badges. The silence in the room was deafening. Janet Wu stared at Margaret with undisguised horror. Robert Martinez looked like he was calculating the legal ramifications. Harold Peterson simply shook his head in disbelief. Margaret, Harold whispered. What have you done? I protected this community, Margaret said, her voice rising to near hysteria. Rivera thinks he can do whatever he wants because he's a cop. Well, I have news for him. This is Willowbrook Estates, and here, I make the rules. Marcus stood slowly, his movement causing Atlas to shift into alert position. No, Mrs. Thornfield. You don't make the rules. You follow them, just like everyone else. And the rules you've broken carry serious consequences. He reached into his folder and pulled out a business card, sliding it across the table to Harold. That's the contact information for Detective Sarah Chen, who'll be handling the criminal investigation into today's incident. She'll be contacting each of you to discuss your knowledge of an involvement in hiring fake police officers. Janet Wu's hands shook as she reached for the card. I swear, I didn't know anything about this. That's what you'll tell Detective Chen, Marcus said. But I have some additional concerns that need to be addressed tonight. He pulled out another set of documents. These are copies of every citation, fine, and complaint the HOA has filed against me over the past 2 years. 47 separate incidents, ranging from excessive lawn watering to unauthorized garden modifications. All of them either frivolous or based on regulations that don't actually exist in the HOA charter. Robert Martinez leaned forward. What are you saying? I'm saying that Mrs. Thornfield has been harassing me systematically, using her position to create a hostile living environment. In legal terms, that's called stalking. In law enforcement terms, it's called establishing a pattern of escalating behavior. Margaret stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. You can't prove harassment. Those were legitimate complaints about what? Marcus's voice cut through. Her protests like a blade. About the roses I planted in memory of my dead wife. About the memorial garden that won the Neighborhood Beautification Award. About the canine officer who's saved more lives than you've probably met in your entire existence. The room fell silent. Even Margaret seemed to shrink back from the raw pain and fury in his voice. My wife died 3 years ago, Marcus continued, his voice quieter now but no less dangerous. Breast cancer. She loved roses. So I planted roses. I followed every rule, got every permit, stayed within every boundary. And you made it your personal mission to destroy the one thing that brought me peace. He turned to face the entire board. So here's what's going to happen. Mrs. Thornfield is going to resign from the HOA board immediately. She's going to face criminal charges for conspiracy to impersonate police officers. And the HOA is going to issue a public apology to every resident for the illegal activities conducted in their name. And if we refuse? Margaret asked, though her voice had lost all its former authority. Marcus smiled, and this time it was genuinely warm. Then I'll do what I do best. I'll investigate. I'll dig into every HOA expense, every vendor contract, every decision made over the past 8 years. I'll examine your personal finances, your business dealings, your tax returns. I'll find every rule you've broken, every line you've crossed, every corner you've cut. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. And when I'm done, you'll wish you'd never heard the name Rive. The State Police Criminal Investigation Division occupied 3 floors of a steel and glass building that had been designed to intimidate. Marcus Rivera sat in his corner office at 6 a.m., surrounded by case files that had nothing to do with drug cartels or organized crime. Instead, his desk was covered with bank statements, contractor invoices, and HOA meeting minutes that told a story of corruption so brazen it would have impressed the criminals he usually pursued. Detective Sarah Chen knocked on his door frame, balancing 2 cups of coffee and a stack of folders. At 38, she was one of the best financial investigators in the state, with a reputation for following paper trails that others couldn't even find. "Tell me you didn't call me in at dawn just to help you settle a neighborhood dispute," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. Marcus accepted the coffee with a grateful nod. "This stopped being a neighborhood dispute the moment they hired fake cops to intimidate me. Now it's a criminal conspiracy with tentacles that reach a lot deeper than I initially thought." He turned his laptop screen toward her, displaying a spreadsheet that had taken him 3 hours to compile. "Margaret Thornfield has been embezzling from the HOA for at least 4 years. The fake police officers were just the tip of the iceberg." Sarah leaned forward, her investigator's instincts kicking in. "Show me." Marcus pulled up a series of bank records. The HOA collects roughly $40,000 annually in fees from the 112 homes in Willowbrook. That money is supposed to go toward maintenance, landscaping, and community improvements. And instead, it's been funding Margaret's personal crusade against anyone who dares to question her authority. He highlighted a series of transactions. Legal fees to intimidate residents. Private investigator fees to dig up dirt on board members who might oppose her. And this beauty, $15,000 to something called Elite Property Management Solutions. Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Let me guess. That's not a real company. It's a shell company registered to Margaret's husband, Frank Thornfield. They've been billing the HOA for specialized consultation services that never existed." Marcus pulled up another document. "But here's where it gets interesting. 3 months ago, a new board member named Robert Martinez was elected on a reform platform. He started asking questions about the budget. And suddenly, the HOA hired Brennan, Walsh and Associates to research enforcement options for non-compliant homeowners. $20,000 in legal fees to find ways to destroy anyone who might challenge Margaret's authority." Sarah whistled low. "That's not just embezzlement. That's using stolen funds to finance a harassment campaign. It gets worse." Marcus opened another file. "I spent yesterday evening interviewing neighbors. Margaret has been systematically targeting anyone who might pose a threat to her control. David Kim, the architect who lives on Elm Street, was fined repeatedly for unauthorized modifications to his deck, modifications that were actually approved by the city and fully compliant with HOA regulations. Let me guess." He started asking questions about the budget too. Worse, he offered to audit the HOA's finances for free, as a service to the community. Marcus pulled up a photo of a pristine deck. Margaret hit him with $5,000 in bogus fines and threatened to place a lien on his house if he didn't pay. Sarah shook her head in disgust. "What about the other residents? Why didn't anyone speak up?" "Because Margaret made examples of the ones who tried." Marcus opened another folder. "Lisa Chen, no relation to you, is a retired teacher who lives on Oak Avenue. She questioned a $300 fine for excessive holiday decorations. at a board meeting last year. And Margaret hired a private investigator to dig into her background. Found out that Lisa had filed for bankruptcy 15 years ago after her husband's cancer treatment. Margaret threatened to share that information with the entire neighborhood unless Lisa paid the fine and stopped asking questions. Sarah's face darkened. That's extortion. It's a pattern of extortion, harassment, and financial fraud that's been going on for years. Marcus stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city that had been his beat for 15 years. But the fake police officers changed everything. That's when Margaret crossed the line from HOA tyrant to federal criminal. Federal. Marcus turned back to her, his expression grim. Impersonating police officers is bad enough. But when those fake officers crossed state lines to get to my house, it became a federal crime. And when they did it using funds stolen from the HOA, it became wire fraud. Sarah leaned back in her chair, processing the implications. You're talking about RICO charges. I'm talking about a criminal enterprise that used fraud, extortion, and intimidation to maintain power over an entire community. Marcus sat back down, his voice taking on the tone he used when briefing prosecutors. Margaret Thornfield didn't just break a few HOA rules. She built a criminal organization. His phone buzzed with a text message. Marcus glanced at it, then looked up at Sarah with a predatory smile. And she just made another mistake. What now? That was Harold Peterson, the HOA treasurer. Margaret called an emergency meeting for tonight. She's trying to rally the remaining board members to fight back against the police harassment and the frivolous charges. Sarah raised an eyebrow. You mean the charges that haven't been filed yet? Exactly. She's about to obstruct justice and conspire to cover up federal crimes. Marcus stood and reached for his jacket. Want to come along? I have a feeling this meeting is going to be very educational. An hour later, Marcus sat in his pickup truck across the street from the Willowbrook Community Center, watching board members arrive for what they thought was a private meeting. Sarah was positioned in an unmarked van with surveillance equipment, while two more detectives waited in a backup vehicle around the corner. Through the community center's large windows, Marcus could see Margaret pacing back and forth, gesturing wildly as she spoke to the assembled board members. Harold Peterson sat slumped in his chair, looking like a man who'd aged 10 years in the past 24 hours. Janet Wu kept checking her phone, probably hoping for a text that would give her an excuse to leave. Audio is coming through clearly, Sarah's voice crackled through Marcus's earpiece. She's really losing it in there. Marcus adjusted his binoculars, focusing on Margaret's face. The woman who had terrorized a community for 8 years was unraveling before his eyes. Her carefully controlled exterior was cracking, revealing the desperate criminal underneath. Don't understand what we're dealing with, Margaret's voice came through the surveillance equipment. Rivera thinks he can destroy everything we've built here. But we have options. We have resources. Margaret. Harold's voice was barely audible. The man arrested 2 people for impersonating police officers. What resources could possibly help us now? The same resources we've always used, Margaret snapped. Money. Influence. Information. I know things about Rivera that could ruin his career. His wife's medical bills nearly bankrupted him. He's been struggling financially for years. Marcus felt his jaw clench. Even now, even facing criminal charges, Margaret was trying to weaponize his grief. I have contacts in the media, Margaret continued. We can make this about police overreach. A grieving widower who can't handle criticism, who abuses his authority. To intimidate innocent volunteers. That's conspiracy to obstruct justice, Sarah's voice whispered in Marcus's ear. And defamation. She's digging her own grave. We need to destroy his credibility before he can destroy ours, Margaret said, her voice rising with manic energy. I've already called Channel 7 News. They are interested in the story of a rogue cop who terrorizes his neighbors. That was enough. Marcus keyed his radio. All units, move in. We have conspiracy to obstruct justice and conspiracy to commit defamation. Execute the warrants. The community center's front door burst open as federal agents swarmed inside. Margaret's face went white as she saw Marcus Rivera walk in behind them, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "Margaret Thornfield," Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority of federal law enforcement. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to impersonate police officers, wire fraud, extortion, and obstruction of justice." As the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, Margaret's carefully constructed world finally collapsed completely. "This isn't over," she hissed. "You can't prove anything. I have lawyers. I have connections." Marcus leaned close to her ear as the agents led her toward the door. "Mrs. Thornfield, I've spent 15 years taking down people who thought they were untouchable. You're not even in the same league." As the police cars pulled away, carrying Margaret Thornfield to federal detention, Marcus stood in the community center parking lot surrounded by the debris of a criminal empire. Harold Peterson emerged from the building, looking shell-shocked and defeated. "Chief Rivera," he said quietly. "What happens to the HOA now? What happens to the community?" Marcus looked at the man who had spent 5 years enabling a tyrant out of fear and complacency. "That's up to you, Harold. You can either be part of the solution, or you can go down with the ship." Harold nodded slowly, understanding that his own reckoning was just beginning. "What do you need from me?" "The truth," Marcus said. "All of it. Every tran." The explosive device attached to Marcus Rivera's mailbox was crude but effective, a pipe bomb designed to maim rather than kill. It detonated at 6:23 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after Margaret Thornfield's arrest, sending shrapnel through the front window of his pickup truck and leaving a crater where his morning newspaper used to land. Marcus had been in his kitchen, grinding coffee beans, when the blast threw him against the counter. Atlas barked frantically, his canine training recognizing the sound of an explosion. By the time Marcus reached his front door, weapon drawn, his neighbors were already emerging from their homes in various states of undress and panic. "Nobody move!" Marcus shouted, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd worked bomb scenes before. "This is a crime scene. Everyone stay back until the bomb squad clears the area." But even as he secured the scene with the efficiency of a seasoned professional, Marcus's mind was racing. Margaret Thornfield was in federal custody, held without bail on multiple felony charges. She couldn't have planted the bomb herself, which meant she had allies, dangerous ones. Detective Sarah Chen arrived within minutes, her face grim as she surveyed the damage. "Whoever did this knew your morning routine," she said, pulling on latex gloves. "They knew you'd be getting your paper right about now." Marcus nodded, studying the blast pattern. "Professional work. Military-grade explosives, precise timing. This wasn't some angry neighbor with a grudge." "No," Sarah agreed. "This was a message. The question is, from whom?" The answer came 6 hours later, delivered by a courier to Marcus's office at State Police Headquarters. The package contained no return address, no fingerprints, and no DNA evidence, just a single photograph and a handwritten note. The photograph showed Marcus watering his roses 3 days earlier, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. Someone had been watching him, studying his habits, preparing for something much worse than a mailbox bomb. The note was brief and to the point: "Back off, or next time we won't miss." Marcus stared at the photograph, recognizing the angle. It had been taken from the abandoned house at the end of Maple Ridge Drive, the foreclosed property that had been sitting empty for 2 years. Someone had been using it as a surveillance post, watching his every move. "Sir?" Detective Tommy Morales knocked on the door frame. "We've got a problem." Marcus looked up from the photograph. "What kind of problem?" "The kind that involves federal judges and emergency hearings." Tommy stepped into the office, his face pale. Margaret Thornfield's lawyer just filed a motion claiming that her arrest was based on fabricated evidence. "They are saying you planted the recording of the fake police officers." "That's impossible. The recording was made during the arrest, with witnesses present. They are claiming it was doctored. And they've got an expert witness who says the audio shows signs of digital manipulation." Tommy sat down heavily. "There's more." Someone leaked details about the HOA investigation to Channel 7 News. They are running a story tonight about a rogue cop who's abusing his authority to settle personal grudges. Marcus felt the walls closing in around him. The bomb had been just the beginning, a way to rattle him, to make him paranoid and reactive. The real attack was coming through the legal system and the media, designed to destroy his credibility. And his career. Who's the leak? Marcus asked. That's what we need to find out. But whoever it is, they have access to sealed federal documents and ongoing investigation files. Tommy paused. Sir, Internal Affairs wants to see you. Tomorrow morning at 9. Marcus had been expecting this. Someone with serious resources and connections was orchestrating a counterattack, using Margaret's arrest as a catalyst to launch a full-scale war against him. The question was, who had that kind of power? The answer came at 11 p.m. that night, when Marcus's home security system detected movement in his backyard. He'd installed additional cameras after the bombing, turning his house into a fortress. Now, those cameras showed two figures in dark clothing approaching his back door. Marcus grabbed his service weapon and keyed his radio. Dispatch, this is Chief Rivera. I have intruders at my residence. Send backup to 247 Maple Ridge Drive. Copy that, Chief. Units en route. Marcus moved through his house with practiced efficiency, Atlas at his side. The dog's training had kicked in, his body language tense and alert. Whatever was happening outside, it wasn't a simple burglary. The first intruder reached Marcus's back door and began working on the lock with professional tools. The second kept watch, a rifle visible in his hands. These weren't random criminals, they were professionals, probably ex-military or law enforcement. Marcus positioned himself at the kitchen window, weapon drawn, waiting for backup. But something was wrong. The response time was too slow. Dispatch should have had units at his house within minutes, but the sirens were nowhere to be heard. His radio crackled with static. Chief Rivera, this is dispatch. We are showing no available units in your area. Estimated response time is 15 minutes. 15 minutes. In a community where response times were normally under 5 minutes, that was a death sentence. Someone had made sure he would be alone when the real attack came. Marcus made a decision. That would have seemed impossible a week ago. He was going to run. Atlas, heel, he whispered, moving toward the front door. His truck was damaged but drivable, and he had a go bag in the garage for exactly this kind of situation. If he could reach his vehicle, he could. The explosion of breaking glass interrupted his thoughts. The intruders had given up on picking the lock and were coming through the back door with overwhelming force. Marcus heard boots on his kitchen floor, voices coordinating a room-by-room search. Check the bedrooms. If he's not here, he's probably already running. Marcus recognized the voice. It belonged to someone he'd arrested 3 years ago, a corrupt cop named Vincent Torino who'd been running protection for drug dealers. Torino had sworn vengeance during his sentencing, but Marcus had assumed it was just the usual criminal bravado. Apparently, he'd been wrong. Atlas, quiet, Marcus whispered, leading his partner toward the garage. If Torino was involved, this wasn't just about the HOA investigation. This was about old enemies using Margaret's arrest as an excuse to settle scores. Marcus reached the garage door and carefully turned the handle. The space was dark and quiet, his damaged truck waiting like a wounded animal. He could hear footsteps moving through his house, getting closer to the garage. He's not in the bedrooms, a voice called out. Check the basement and the garage. Marcus opened the truck door as quietly as possible and helped Atlas into the passenger seat. The engine turned over on the first try and Marcus backed out of the garage with his headlights off, using only the faint glow of street lamps to navigate. As he reached the end of his driveway, Marcus saw the first police car finally arriving. But instead of stopping to help, the officer, someone Marcus didn't recognize, drove past without slowing down. The corruption went deeper than he'd imagined. Margaret Thornfield hadn't just been embezzling from the HOA. She'd been part of a larger network, one that included dirty cops, corrupt officials, and criminals who'd been waiting for the right Moment to strike back. Marcus drove through the darkened streets of Willowbrook, his mind racing. He couldn't go to the police, he didn't know who to trust. He couldn't go to the FBI, they were probably compromised too. He was on his own, with only his canine partner and his 15 years of law enforcement experience to keep him alive. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "You should have stayed in your lane, Rivera. Now you're going to pay for what you've done to our friends." Marcus deleted the message and turned off his phone. They were tracking him through the GPS, using his own department's resources against him. He was fighting a war on multiple fronts, against enemies who had access to law enforcement databases and federal investigation files. But Marcus Rivera had survived 15 years of policing the worst criminals in the state. He'd taken down drug cartels, organized crime syndicates, and corrupt officials who thought they were untouchable. Margaret Thornfield and her allies had made one crucial mistake: they'd underestimated the man they were trying to destroy. As he drove through the night, Atlas alert and ready beside him, Marcus began to formulate a plan. If they wanted to play dirty, he would show them what dirty really looked like. If they wanted to destroy his career, he would destroy their entire organization. The war for Willowbrook Estates had just become a fight for survival. And Marcus Rivera intended to be the last man standing. But first, he had to survive the night. And judging by the headlights that had just appeared in his rearview mirror, that was going to be harder than he'd thought.